The gilded bookmark my grandmother Serafina Winslow left behind still rests on my desk. The vine patterns etched into the metal haven't had time to fade, yet just as I was about to notice them, I received a court summons from my parents. The sharpest battles within our family were never hysterical arguments. Rather, they were fractures cloaked in propriety. My name is Mayim Collette, and I live in Santa Barbara, California, a small town famous for its sunshine and ocean waves. But just 1 week after my grandmother's funeral, my life plunged into a cold winter devoid of warmth. There was no dramatic slamming of doors, no confrontations with red-rimmed eyes, only documents stamped with the City Hall seal, neatly stacked on the counter of my floral studio, each word chillingly cold. My parents, Camilla Thornley and Samuel Thornley, are suing me for unlawful possession of the inheritance. They're certain I'll be scared, that I'll obediently hand over everything my grandmother left me. They're convinced that I, a young woman running a small flower shop, wouldn't have the courage to stand up against my father, a renowned architect, or my mother, a gallery manager, and even less confidence to prevail against my older brother Leopold Thornley, who works as a fashion brand strategist. But little did they know, Serafi had long since seen through the greed lurking in the crevices of human hearts. Even when I was still clueless, she'd already paved the way for me, shielding me from life's storms and tempests. When my fingertips brushed against my parents' names on the summons, I felt no fragile collapse within, only a sudden, stark clarity and unwavering resolve. Some bonds of kinship are slowly eroded by desire, yet I'm determined to hold on to my grandmother's last, truest love. If you're willing to listen, I'd like to share with you everything from this silent war, the stories of being favored and overlooked, of loyalty and betrayal, of how one girl managed to catch the light her grandmother extended to her, rising from the ruins of her family. I grew up in a household where affection was deeply unbalanced. My parents' favoritism was never hidden, it was merely revealed in subtle ways, subtly signaling who truly held their hearts. I was the youngest daughter in the family, and from the very beginning, I lived in the shadow of my older brother, Leopold Thornley, a well-known fashion brand strategist in the industry. Ever since our school days, every word he spoke and every decision he made were treated by my parents as absolute truth. Design portfolios he dreamed up and bespoke suits he requested were always readily available. Even if he botched a brand collaboration, my parents would just smile and say, "Young people need to learn through trial and error." As for me, not even the tiniest mistake was ever tolerated. They were extremely strict with me, yet stingy to the extreme when it came to showing me any affection. My childhood was spent constantly watching my parents' every move, desperately trying to figure out the right balance to please them, just hoping to catch even a fleeting glimpse of their tenderness. My mom, Camilla, is a gallery manager. Whenever she looked at Leopold, there was a softness in her eyes that I'd never known before, almost as if he were the rarest treasure she'd ever collected. My dad, Samuel, is an architectural designer. Once right in front of me, he boasted to his industry colleagues that Leopold would be the family's greatest pride. I stood there clutching the floral design sketch I'd just finished, while he treated me as if I didn't exist. I realized early on that even though I lived in this home, I was never truly seen, merely a shadow cast by Leopold's dazzling light. My parents spared no effort in supporting everything Leopold did: fashion salons, overseas training programs, industry summits. They were always there, attending every single one. At the dinner table, all they talked about was crafting his professional future, while I could only quietly clear away the dishes. I devoted myself wholeheartedly to mastering floral art, staying up late every night poring over botanical illustrated guides and painstakingly copying their designs, hoping that my outstanding work would finally earn them a glance of attention. Yet when I handed my award-winning design draft to my mom, she merely glanced at it briefly before tossing it onto the counter. Meanwhile, Leopold brought back a letter of intent for a brand collaboration, and they framed it, proudly hanging it in the most prominent spot in the living room. Between us, there was never any argument, only a silent, growing rift. As attention became a luxury I could never attain, this bias deepened with each passing year. I kept all my emotions locked away inside, learning to become invisible within my own home, except for my grandmother, Serafina Winslow, who saw right through all my bitterness and unfulfilled longing. My grandmother was my dad's mother. She lived just a few minutes away from us. Before retiring, she'd been a masterful restorer of ancient books. Every afternoon after school, I couldn't wait to visit her, not just to escape the coldness at home, but because she was the only one who truly understood me. She'd patiently ask me about my interpretations of flowers and plants, cared deeply about what I feared and what I looked forward to. Even when I remained silent, she never pressed me further. Instead, she'd simply reassure me with her gentle voice. We often sat in her living room, bathed in sunlight and filled with the lingering aroma of tea. I'd snuggle up close to her side, and when it got cold, she'd hand me a knitted blanket and softly reassure me. I remember her once saying to me, "Being overlooked doesn't mean you're unworthy of value." Those words were like seeds, quietly planted deep within my heart. At home, the favoritism never lessened. Leopold's accomplishments were lavishly praised, while my floral arrangements went completely unnoticed. The more I felt neglected, the more I leaned on my grandmother. She taught me how to bake cookies, how to arrange flowers and plants, and how to manage my savings. She also encouraged me to speak up confidently and assertively. All those moments of companionship and guidance became the armor she built for me, armor that later helped me weather every storm and hardship. Years later, I opened a floral studio in Santa Barbara and began living alone. The only family greetings I received were perfunctory pleasantries offered out of obligation. Soon after, I noticed that my grandmother was starting to become forgetful, occasionally unable to recall the titles of ancient texts. A vague sense of unease began to creep into my heart. Without hesitation, I adjusted my studio schedule and started driving to see her at least 3 times a week. I'd bring along her favorite treats, fresh flowers and herbs, patiently help her organize her old tools, and spend time sitting with her in the sun, chatting away. One autumn afternoon, she sat in the garden, gazing at the lavender. The vulnerability in her eyes broke my heart. I held her hand tightly and told her that I'd always be by her side. During those days, I spent nearly half of my time by my grandmother's side, afraid to miss even a single moment of her company. Yet my parents never took the initiative to ask about her condition. When they did call occasionally, it was only for polite small talk. As for Leopold, he didn't send so much as a single message of concern. I stayed by my grandmother's side, listening to her recount stories from her days restoring ancient books, committing every word she said to memory, just wanting to hold on to as many warm memories as possible with her. My parents would visit my grandmother now and then, but their visits were never genuine expressions of care. They came only to maintain appearances. My father, Samuel, used the pretext of visiting her to chat with the neighbors about architectural plans, completely ignoring her pale complexion. My mother, Camilla, was preoccupied with examining the old ornaments in our home, calculating whether they could be sold at the gallery for profit, and she didn't even bother to offer my grandmother a glass of water. Leopold showed up even less often, each time feigning excuses to skip important meetings, snapping a few photos for his social media feed to pretend he was being filial, and then hastily leaving after perfunctorily washing a few dishes under the pretext of having to rush to meet a client. He never once sat down to have a single meaningful conversation with his grandmother. Her health took a sharp turn for the worse, and the doctor recommended hospice care. So I simply closed up my studio and stayed by her side around the clock, feeding her water, wiping her body, holding her hand and accompanying her through every night. When she was lucid, she'd clutch my hand tightly and whisper softly, "Don't let others define who you are." I promised her through tears that I wouldn't. She passed away peacefully, and I sat by her side, gently stroking her hand over and over again, refusing to believe that she was really gone. Hidden within this grief was not only my deep affection for my grandmother, but also a bitter ache at the indifference of my parents, who hadn't even spent a single day genuinely by her side during her final days. The funeral was held in a wooden church with a white roof, located near her home. The ceremony was solemn and dignified. Beside the altar stood an arrangement of flowers I'd carefully crafted myself, all lavender and chamomile, the very blooms Serafina loved most. People who'd known her for decades came to share their memories of her, how kind and warm she'd been, and how quietly focused she'd been when restoring ancient books. I stood in a front row seat, listening quietly, treasuring those words deep within my heart, because what they described was the very person I loved so deeply, yet also the one I feared I might never find again. Leopold stood beside his parents, who greeted the mourners with practiced grace, their expressions filled with compassion and dignity. Mother Camilla wept, yet her tears seemed strangely distant, almost as if she were mourning something she was supposed to feel sad about, rather than truly feeling what she was experiencing. Father Samuel remained utterly composed, chatting casually with others about the value and market prospects of ancient book restoration. Though I was standing just a few feet away from them, it felt as though an invisible wall separated us. We shared the same surname, yet the truth had utterly divided us. After the funeral ended, I returned alone to Serafina's home. Without her presence, the house felt different, quieter, yes, but still riddled with traces of her, unfinished ancient books on the desk, dried flowers and herbs basking on the windowsill. Repair tools neatly tucked away in the drawers. I slowly walked through each room, touching the pages of her restored books, the wicker chair she used to sit in every winter. She'd gaze out the window at the first snowfall. I sat there for a long time, realizing that my life had been utterly transformed. I'd lost the one person who'd always believed in me, yet I didn't know that the next change awaiting me would reveal everything she'd already seen clearly. A week after the funeral, we gathered in the office of our family lawyer, Willoughby Hudson, a vintage mansion standing beside the town hall, with tall arched windows and heavy solid wood doors that seemed designed not to carry sound, but rather to block it out entirely. The room we were in was impeccably tidy, almost cold in its precision. Behind the lawyer's desk, rows of leather-bound notebooks were neatly arranged. I sat on a wicker chair facing him, while my parents and Leopold took seats on the sofa across the room. This seating arrangement wasn't deliberate, yet it felt like a silent symbol. The air itself had already drawn clear boundaries. Willoughby Hudson adjusted his glasses and flipped through a neatly arranged stack of documents, as if this inheritance reading had been meticulously planned all along. His voice remained professionally calm, utterly devoid of emotion, yet without any deliberate emphasis. He began reading out Serafina's estate, starting with the assets I was familiar with, the house, the savings account, the antique books she'd collected over the years, and that trust account she'd always said, "We'll talk about it when the time is right." I listened intently, though the sadness deep within me still lingered. Hearing her name pronounced in legal terms somehow felt alien and unreal. Mom Camilla kept her hands neatly folded on her knees, her expression a delicate blend of anticipation and deliberate restraint. Her eyes occasionally darted toward the documents on the table. Dad Samuel leaned slightly against the back of the sofa, his jaw clenched, but his demeanor utterly composed, as if he'd already prepared himself for whatever lay ahead, ready to face it all with whatever tone he might need. Leopold stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the potted plant beside his desk, perhaps trying to project an air of maturity and patience. Yet his fingers were quietly tracing the surface of his phone screen, replying to work messages. When Willoughby Hudson announced the distribution of the inheritance, no one spoke. Still, I felt as though the very air in the room had frozen solid. He said that I would receive 90% of Serafina's entire estate, including the house, all her financial accounts, her collection of rare books, and even her personal belongings. The remaining 10% would be split evenly between Mom and Dad and Leopold himself. The numbers were crystal clear, devoid of any embellishment or euphemisms, just a stark, undeniable fact, delivered in a tone of calm finality. I kept my head lowered, not out of shame, but because I could sense the silence behind me growing heavier and heavier. Leopold took a slow, deliberate breath. The screen of his phone dimmed, yet he remained utterly silent. Mom Camilla's hand stayed resting lightly on her knee, though her fingers tightened imperceptibly. Dad Samuel blinked once, as if reorienting himself, his lips pressed tightly together in a straight line, but still, not a single word was uttered. Nobody raised their voice, no immediate protests erupted, and no one pointed fingers. This utterly unresponsive silence was heavier than any outburst, a silence steeped in the weight of the past. Willoughby Hudson kept talking, explaining that Sir Rafi had left behind a private letter that would be delivered in private at a later time. His tone remained unchanged. He merely added that the trust account included a standard protective clause, which would take effect in the event of any dispute. He didn't elaborate further, but I noticed his gaze briefly fall upon me, not as a warning, but as a kind of confirmation. The trust includes a protective clause that kicks in automatically if a dispute arises. That was all. No one asked for additional explanation, yet beneath everyone's restrained expressions, I could sense lingering questions. The silence spread once again, not an empty silence, but one brimming with calculation. Finally, Mom Camilla spoke up to thank him, her voice soft and polite, almost unnaturally courteous. Dad Samuel nodded in response. Leopold stood up, but his movement was somewhat sluggish, as if he were still processing details that would take time to fully absorb. We walked out of the office together, yet we felt like complete strangers. The hallway was carpeted with a vintage rug, muffling our footsteps until they vanished entirely. The air felt heavy and oppressive. Outside, the winter sky was a gentle shade of gray, lending an unremarkable dullness to the streets of Santa Barbara. Mom suggested we schedule a family dinner sometime soon. Dad mentioned that on the way home, we'd be passing by the hardware store. Leopold never once looked at me, and I didn't feel much like saying anything either, not because I wanted to become cold or distant, but because by then, the rift between us had grown so deep that it could no longer be ignored. That evening, when I returned to my apartment, I gently placed the envelope containing the inheritance documents beside the floral design workbench. Silence enveloped me like an incoming tide. This distribution has no winners, only the stark, naked truth, has long been hollowed out by desire. And we all know this is just the beginning of a war. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere rapidly deteriorated. There was no feigned easing of tensions. Instead, the confrontation grew increasingly intense, step by step. Every conversation felt as if it had been dipped in ice, every word pierced straight to the heart. Mom Camilla called frequently, using falsely tender tones to try to win me over. She asked about the studio's latest developments, sighed over Grandma's passing, then abruptly shifted gears to press me to revise the inheritance arrangement. She bluntly declared that keeping the ancient books a waste in my hands was pointless and that they'd only be worth anything if entrusted to her gallery. All the while, she kept talking about balancing the family, yet her eyes revealed nothing but calculation. Dad Samuel, on the other hand, adopted an unyielding stance. He insisted there'd been a misunderstanding in the will, mocking me for running a flower shop, a place he claimed couldn't possibly understand the value of ancient texts or manage assets properly. His tone dripped with condescending pressure, utterly convinced that I'd cave just as I'd done as a child. But I remained steadfastly resolute in my refusal. Leopold quickly joined the pressure camp, sending a lengthy message that amounted to moral blackmail. He claimed that the inheritance distribution was undermining family harmony, insisted that as the eldest son he owed it to himself to take responsibility, and slandered me by saying I was just sitting on the assets doing nothing. Then, with feigned concern, he pretended to say, "It's not about the money, it's about the family." After I refused, he immediately threw his mask off, calling me selfish and accusing me of being blinded by grief, a label they'd been nailing onto me from childhood all the way through adulthood. The conflict finally erupted in full force. My mom questioned whether I even understood what responsibility meant, subtly implying that if I gave up my citizenship, I could get a share of the inheritance. My dad dredged up old grievances, meticulously listing all the times I'd spent their tuition money, forcing me to show gratitude and back down. And Leopold accused me of alienating the family and harming his brand image. Each accusation felt like a knife stabbing straight into my heart. Though I was deeply hurt, I remained strangely lucid, having anticipated their greed all along, yet still never imagining they'd be so cruel. I firmly reject all their demands. I understand my grandmother's intentions all too well. Her choice of me wasn't out of favoritism. She knew I'd safeguard her legacy, rather than treating it as a tool for profit. This heartfelt trust of hers, I'll never compromise on it. Seeing that I remained completely unmoved, they finally tore off their masks. Their phone calls were filled with sharp insults and icy threats. Leopold dredged up old, long-forgotten incidents, slandering me as a child for snatching his toys and sapping my parents' energy. My dad made a chilling threat, vowing to cut off the professional connections that supported my studio, ensuring that I'd have no way to make a living. Meanwhile, my mom pretended to be hurt and asked me pointedly, "Can you really live with your conscience?" Then, one evening, I received a hefty court summons in my studio's email inbox. They'd actually hired lawyers and filed a lawsuit against me, accusing me of manipulating my elderly grandmother and illegally seizing her inheritance, attempting to overturn the will. Sitting at the very dining table where I'd once shared morning light with my grandmother, I spread out the cold summons. The only sound in the room was the hum of the humidifier. There was no shock, only an icy chill and utter determination. I should have seen this coming. When it comes to money, they're willing to throw away even their last shred of dignity. Since they've chosen to go to war, I'll see this through to the end. I immediately dialed my lawyer, Claire Blackley, determined to uphold my grandmother's wishes and stay true to my own principles. On the day of the trial, the air in Santa Barbara County Courthouse felt unusually heavy. Everybody seemed unable to take a deep breath. The gallery was almost completely filled, not because outsiders cared about the outcome of the case, but because Mom, Dad, and Leopold had brought along their friends and colleagues, wanting others to witness just how clueless I'd been. I sat beside my lawyer, Claire Blackley, a woman I'd only met a few weeks earlier. She was an experienced civil attorney with a quiet, unassuming confidence that didn't need to be flaunted or enforced by force. She'd pored over every single page of the trust documents, Serafina's medical records, and proof of the estate plan, scrutinizing them again and again. Following her instructions, I moved forward with a weary kind of trust, one that only emerges when you feel utterly out of options. My parents were sitting across from me, their expressions stiff and their attitudes resolute. My father, Samuel, wore a crisp suit and clutched a folder of architectural blueprints in his hand, as if he were about to flaunt his respectability at any moment. My mother, Camilla, was dressed impeccably and elegantly, yet her eyes betrayed an underlying anxiety. Leopold, wearing a custom-tailored suit, looked somewhat uneasy, but he tried hard to mask it with indifference. He avoided meeting my gaze. Ever since the lawsuit was filed, he hadn't spoken a word to me. Though we were standing just a few feet apart, we might as well have been strangers. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose to their feet. The trial began with the usual formalities, stating the purpose of the lawsuit, confirming identities, and attorney-client relationships. The tone was polite, yet charged with a tense undercurrent, just like all anger when it's carefully disguised as rationality. Their lawyer spoke first, claiming that the estate distribution was utterly unfair, alleging that Serafina had become confused in her later years and had been influenced by me, and even accusing me of taking advantage of Serafina's favoritism to further my own interests. He spoke of the long-standing imbalance in family roles, of Leopold's inheritance rights as the eldest son, and of the expectations that all of us should have had. At one point, he even hinted that I had deliberately distanced myself from Serafina and the rest of the family in order to monopolize the inheritance. That remark felt like a cold gust of wind sweeping through the courtroom, but Claire Blackley remained utterly unflappable. She simply sat quietly, composed and calm, flipping through documents in her hands. When it was her turn to speak, she rose to her feet without changing her posture in the slightest. Her voice was steady, neither raised nor exaggerated. It was simply clear and powerful. She told the court that this will and trust had been carefully drafted by Serafina when she was fully capable of making informed legal decisions. She presented medical records from a top-tier hospital and certification from a professional estate planning team as proof. She cited the date of signing, the official documentation, and independent appraisal reports, all of which had been prepared well over 2 years before Serafina fell ill. Indeed, she even produced an audio recording made during Serafina's lifetime, in which Serafina explained that she had left most of her estate to me precisely because only I understood her deep passion for ancient manuscripts and would take good care of them. With each word Claire Blackley spoke, their arguments began to crumble bit by bit. Then, she asked the judge to unseal and read aloud a previously confidential clause. The judge glanced at the document, nodded, and the court clerk loudly proclaimed the contents of the clause. The clause explicitly included both an irrevocable clause and a trust structure for spendthrifts. Should any beneficiary ever challenge or attempt to alter the will, they would immediately forfeit their rightful share, all of which would be donated to the Ancient Book Preservation Foundation designated by Serafina, and would also be required to bear all litigation costs. The courtroom instantly fell into a deathly silence, a silence so profound it felt as though a door had been slammed shut once and for all. Mom Camilla's face turned pale, her body trembling. Dad Samuel leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched tight, his face ashen. For the first time in weeks, Leopold looked at me, his eyes filled with confusion, anger, and pleading, as if I could somehow set everything right. This wasn't a trap I'd set, I simply hadn't tried to evade it. Once the judge confirmed the validity of the terms, the 10% share they'd been fighting over vanished in an instant, and they were left to bear the full cost of the litigation. The courtroom was devoid of noise. All that remained was a heavy sense of acceptance. At that moment, the truth was laid bare. After the trial ended, they didn't come over to me. Instead, the three of them huddled together in their shared grief, yet each blamed the others. Dad accused Mom of acting impulsively, while Mom blamed Leopold for stoking the flames. Claire Blackley and I walked out of the courthouse, and the sea breeze of Santa Barbara gently caressed us. I felt no triumph, only a profound relief. As time passed slowly, silence became the only bond between us, not the comforting kind of silence that needs no words yet speaks volumes with mutual understanding, but rather the heavy, oppressive silence that lingers after love has faded. Ever since the court's verdict, my parents became unusually taciturn. They never spoke directly to me, nor did they offer any apology. Instead, they carried their disappointment around like a shadow, following them wherever they went. I heard from a distant acquaintance that Dad Samuel's architectural design firm has lost several clients, and several exhibits at Mom Camilla's gallery have been removed. They're finding it incredibly difficult to explain what's happened, yet they're reluctant to admit what they've actually done. The truth hangs over them like a shadow, influencing their reputations in ways beyond their control. Leopold's reaction, by contrast, is entirely different. He's busy trying to make excuses for what's occurred, blaming the court for being unfair, accusing the lawyer of partiality, even going so far as to accuse Serafi of favoring others. Yet he never once considers examining his own choices. He hasn't reached out to me, no messages, no calls. Instead, on social media, he's subtly implying that I'm ungrateful, emotionally distancing himself further and further from me, as if simply keeping his distance could somehow help him escape his own anger, and the realization that, precisely because of that anger, he's already lost something truly important. For a brief period, he threw himself into his work, hoping to prove himself through new brand collaborations. But when the pressure of disappointment became impossible to hide any longer, he once again chose to withdraw, turning down many offers. I understood him. He just wasn't ready to face it all yet. Yet his refusal to confront the truth made reconciliation utterly impossible. As for me, the world had gained a whole new kind of quiet. I stayed in Santa Barbara, running my floral studio and living a peaceful, simple life. Each morning, I'd sit on my apartment balcony, sipping chamomile tea, with Serafina's ancient books resting beside me. Sunlight streamed onto the pages of the books, like a gentle blessing. I took the initiative to join the Ancient Book Preservation Foundation she supported, the very one that had received the inheritance from her family. At first, I volunteered twice a week. Later, I devoted even more time to it. Occasionally, I'd bring along some floral arrangements to decorate the foundation spaces, letting the ancient books and flowers complement each other beautifully. Every moment spent there felt like a conversation with my grandmother, a continuation of her love. I never flaunted my involvement. It was in quietly giving that my sincerity truly shone through. Sometimes I'd organize catalogs of ancient books. Other times I'd teach children how to make bookmarks from flowers and herbs or tell them stories about those ancient texts. Watching their curious eyes, I felt a deep sense of peace. My parents and Leopold would never have understood my grandmother. She firmly believed that dignity comes from earning one's own living, whereas their generosity always came with strings attached. Leopold had inherited this very mindset. Losing them was excruciating, yet clinging desperately would only make the pain even worse. I didn't reach out first, nor did I close the door completely. I simply turned around and walked toward my own life, tending to my flower shop, spending time with ancient books, and dedicating myself to volunteer work. Occasionally, sadness would strike, sadness for my grandmother, for the family I'd once dreamed of, and for the little girl in me who'd longed so desperately to be seen. But over time, that sadness would soften, becoming quiet yet unshakable. I could hold on to it without letting it swallow me whole. Mi framed Serafia's handwriting on the studio wall. Those notes she'd tucked into old books. To you, you're already good enough. Back then, I took those words as encouragement. Now, I see them for what they truly are, the truth. I didn't win, I simply stayed true to myself. The hardest battles often unfold within our families. Love should never be an excuse for hurting others, and loyalty isn't a reason to abandon who we are. Serafi understood that protecting someone can also be an act of love, and strength doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes, turning away with dignity and holding onto your integrity is the very best way to grow. Thank you for listening to my story, from start to finish. I'm deeply grateful for your time, your company, and for taking the effort to sit down and truly feel the emotions woven into this tale. Every family story is complex, and perhaps in mine, there's a piece that resonates with your own experiences, about the bitterness of being unseen, about the difficulty of staying true to yourself, and about learning to grow even amid pain. If you have ideas, insights, or similar experiences, I'd love to hear them. Your voice matters here.